Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue our investigation of the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbour. Today we pick up the story in 1937, when Japan took the fateful decision to launch a full-scale invasion of China, a crucial step on the road to December the 7th, 1941. Hi Jesse, another week, another podcast. Here we are again, and we are back to Southeast Asia, a part of the world that we haven't visited that often in our podcast. So it's really time we spend a bit more time and effort on this area, because it is, as I said in our last podcast, it is a world war, isn't it? We are very, very focused and concentrating on the European and African theaters of war, but actually there's more to it. So today, again, round two with our look at Pearl Harbour. In the last episode, we had a long stretch back into history, all the way back to the 19th century, setting some of these strategic aims, objectives, and explaining them and seeing what really the Japanese were all about in that particular time. And we ended up in 1937. And this is where, as I already said, we're going to pick up the story again, because something happens now. I already mentioned it in the opening sentence. It's the invasion of mainland China in 1937. So Jesse, what happens there? Let's not go back to what happened before. That's all, folks. That's all in the previous podcast. So what happens in 1937?
Well, in 1937, the Japanese leadership makes a decision to launch a full-scale invasion of China. So they already controlled Manchuria, these three provinces in northeastern China. They'd controlled them since 1931 fully, since 1905 indirectly. But in 1937, they kind of go all in. And just to remind our listeners from the last episode, Japan is constantly concerned about these three different strategic directions. The north towards the Soviet Union by this point in the 1930s, to the west of them, which is China, and to the south of them into the Pacific and Southeast Asia. So these are their kind of three directions that they're thinking about strategically. And they choose to go west in 1937 and to double down. One of the reasons why that's an appealing choice is because they feel that China is going to provide markets for Japanese imperial economy, that it's going to provide more resources in addition to what they already got in Manchuria. Resources is something we also talked about in the last episode. So it all starts, we're not going to go blow by blow through the whole war between China and Japan. We'll save that for a future mini series in this podcast, I would imagine, because it's a very fascinating story. But to compress that to fit our story of trying to get to explain Pearl Harbour, there's a clash, an armed clash between Chinese nationalist troops and Japanese occupying troops at a bridge near Beijing called the Marco Polo Bridge. And Chiang Kai-shek, who's the leader of nationalist China, decides this time I'm not going to give in. This time we're going to fight back. It's time. Even though there's a Chinese civil war going on, which is on a bit of a hiatus at the moment with the communists under Mao, Chiang decides, no, we're going to resist. The Japanese then launch a full-scale invasion. It's going to go on until 1945, so we won't do the whole thing. But in those first couple of years, the Japanese advance. They win major victories. They capture Shanghai, which is the economic center of China, with all the international concessions, all the international businesses there from the US, from Europe, and so on. They take the capital of China at the time, which was Nanjing. They commit terrible, terrible atrocities there. The rape of Nanking is not called that for nothing. But they don't really defeat China. They beat the Chinese armies that they face, usually, but it costs them a lot of blood and treasure, and they don't come out with anything decisive. They get pulled into a quagmire of constant well, we'll advance along this railway, capture this town, knock out some Chinese units there, but then we don't have the strength to fully occupy this massive country of hundreds of millions of people that's 50 or 100 times bigger than Japan. So we're stuck, right? Because the Chinese won't give up. So there's campaigns in 1938, campaigns in 1939, campaigns in 1940, campaigns in 1941, even in China by the Japanese army. And they're not able to achieve a decisive result. And this, I think, is decisive when we're thinking about the road to Pearl Harbor. Japan has committed itself to one of these strategic axes. They're not able to get out of it. It's costing them an unholy amount of money to continue this war against China. There's no end in sight. And this creates a strategic dilemma for them because they're using up resources they don't have, and they have other strategic security concerns and other imperial ambitions as well. And I'll throw it to you to give your 2 cents in on that.
Well, the first thing I want to say, which is kind of related what you've said, but the point here is this is now episode 2 on this particular topic. In the last episode and so far, I haven't even mentioned the Germans once. So, of course, they don't really fit in. But here's the perfect example to throw the Germans in. So, thank God for this. Very, very briefly, a complete side story here and a sideshow. But the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalists, were actually trained by the German army. And the man who's in charge of this is a German former general called Hans von Seeckt, who had been the head of the army between 1920 and 1926. If you want to learn more about Hans von Seeckt, read my PhD. It's all in there, which I wrote a long, long time ago. Forgotten most of what I said in there, actually, to be perfectly honest. Complete side story. But you are, of course, absolutely right. This is causing a problem. You can see, in a way, a mirror image of what happens a little bit later in the West as well. So you're very successful in your tactical operational actions, but they do not lead to strategic victory. So the Japanese, in a way, a little bit like the Germans up to 1941, are, to use that phrase, winning themselves to death. They're expanding, yes, they occupy more territory, but they simply can't bring the war to a successful conclusion. And what is also very important when you look at the relationship with other nations, in particular, for example, the Americans. So first of all, this expansion is putting, generally speaking, a strain on the relationship. Because the Americans still see themselves as the defender of freedom and all these things. We talked a little bit about this in the previous episode as well. Difficult story, but that's how they see themselves. Business interests, of course, are also a matter here. But there's something else that is really a problem in this particular period between the Japanese and the Americans. All consequences of this invasion. And they're all to do more or less with the Nanjing operation. You already mentioned it. So the massacre of Nanjing, this big city in China, the Japanese go in and kill tens of thousands, some people say even hundreds of thousands of civilians. So it's absolutely brutal and nasty what happens there. But the Americans are at the receiving end, you might say, at this particular operation as well. And there is 3 things that really matter. The first thing is the so-called Ellison incident. And that is an American consul, so Ellison, who is in Nanjing at the time. And as the Japanese get in there, he's basically beaten up. He's struck by the Japanese. And of course, that does not go down well, as you can imagine. The second one is the USS Panay incident, which happened only 2 months before that. There's basically an American patrol boat in the area not too far from Nanjing, which gets bombed by the Japanese. Again, it's a bit of debate. Was it deliberate or not? Probably it wasn't, but they were there. The Japanese are fighting. So unfortunate, in inverted commas, these things happen, but you can put 2 and 2 together, this together with the other incident. It's not sending out a great message. And the third one, of course, is Nanjing itself. So the killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians doesn't go down well in the American press and with the American public, as you can imagine. That's caused an extra strain. The relations had been strained beforehand, but actually they kind of found some sort of modus vivendi, so they got on, they kind of cope with each other. But this is now the beginning of, you might say, a new era. And as a consequence of that, the Americans and the president now sit down, have a think about this. So what is it that we can do to stop these Japanese, to support the Chinese? They start supporting the Chinese as well with material to a degree. You already mentioned it earlier. Much more than when World War II really breaks out. You might argue that the Chinese only continue to fight because of American support, a little like the Soviets as well during World War II, something we discussed in a previous episode. But the Americans can see that these things are not really getting better. And on the American side, for example, in July 1940, the decision is taken to cut off shipments of scrap iron, steel, and aviation fuel. And fuel is the important thing here. And of course, the Japanese see that as a very unfriendly act, in particular because, as we said earlier, they simply do not have the industrial base to produce all these things. And it now comes down to, you might even say, an economic war between the Americans and the Japanese. And it's a bit of a race, you might say. Americans say, when you cut them off from all of these things, the Japanese now say, no, we need to be more imperialist. We need to win more of these materials and raw materials and resources in China before we feel pain from being cut off from the world market from the Americans. But I've jumped quite a bit from 1937 to 1940, so I'm quite sure you want to say one or two things of what happens in between.
Absolutely. I'll fill a couple of little gaps to get us up to this point, because you've mentioned a crucial moment as well, right? Where the Americans introduced these sanctions on the Japanese for different things. This story of sanctions and embargoes is going to sich zuspitzen, as we would say in German, to get even hotter, right? To come to an even more crucial breaking point. But what I find interesting about this situation for Japan in 1939-ish, around there, 37, 38, 39, 40, all of their strategic problems are coming together in this never-ending quagmire war in China. So you have the fact that their army is tied down there, which hampers their strategic options, right? You have a huge rivalry between the army and the navy in Japanese politics and society. Both very influential, both have different strategic preferences for which direction Japan should go. The army is always more concerned about potential conflict with the Soviet Union and China. The navy is always more concerned about this southern and Pacific direction. They each have very influential ministers in the different governments. And the army in particular is not always fully under the control of the government. They do things in the field, they get ahead of where government would want them to be, and they take the initiative, usually more aggressively. And we're going to see a couple of examples of that in this 39 to 41 lead up. So all of these things are coming together with the conflict in China, including the foreign support for China, as you mentioned. So the Soviet Union is actually the main supplier of nationalist China after Germany. So Germany kind of gets out of the picture in the 30s in terms of supplying nationalist China. The Soviets start supplying nationalist China, which the Japanese are not very happy about. And then the UK and the US, and to a lesser extent France, begin lending China money in order to buy arms from different suppliers in order to continue fighting for its independence. So from the Japanese point of view, all roads kind of lead to China in a way. All of your strategic problems are coming together there. And then things get a little bit hot. In 1939, there are actually border clashes with Soviet forces between the Soviets and the Japanese. In particular, there's a famous battle at Khalkhin Gol between Japanese occupying forces and the Soviets. And the Soviets win that battle. It's a very interesting battle. We won't go into the details. But the point for Japan is that you need to find a solution to some of this. You can't have all of these fronts being dangerous at once and have your entire army tied down in this quagmire in China. In 1940, and we're not going to do too many names here because I think it's a challenge to keep all of these mostly unfamiliar for our Western audience names straight. But Prince Konoye is the Japanese prime minister from July 1940, and he's a significant figure. He's also looking domestically, right? Japan, we talked about their limited economic potential. Their economy is not doing great. They even have some food shortages going on domestically. So that also puts pressure on ending the war in China to be able to exploit its resources. And then, of course, they start looking, well, how can we stop these foreign powers from helping the Chinese? And that sets off a bit of a domino effect leading towards Pearl Harbor.
Yes, it does. And again, you need to look a little bit to what happens also in the other part or other parts of the world, particularly Europe in 1940, because in 1940, France is defeated by Germany and
French
government falls, the country collapses, the northern part is occupied by the Germans. The southern part, however, remains technically an independent country, Vichy France. And all the former colonies technically still come under Vichy France. So they're still colonies of the Free French, so not in the de Gaulle's way, but in the way that the people would have seen it in those days, the Free France not occupied by the Germans. So you still have French IndoChina sitting there. And what is interesting is that the Japanese think a lot of the support that the Chinese are getting is coming through French Indochina. So a bit of, you might say, reverse story of what you see, for example, during the Vietnam War. So now everything is going from south to north into China to fight against the Japanese. And this is one of the reasons, again, in addition to the economic reasons and the raw materials and all these things that we were talked about, that in 1940 the Japanese decide to take over or to invade French Indochina. Now, they make some sort of very clever diplomatic moves because officially the government in Vichy says, no, you know what, that's perfectly okay, that's fine. So you can have that. Colony for the time being. Making quite light of this, but that's the basically the subtext to it. The Japanese go in there, so it's not a reason to go to war for the French or even for the Americans, because there's a lot of diplomatic stuff going on. And of course, let's not forget, France has been defeated beforehand, so they don't have particularly strong cards at that particular time. But you can now begin to see how, as you've already said, how the Japanese are now beginning to push even further into the southwest of the continent. So basically, you might say they're bypassing mainland China to get into French Indochina. They're trying to, so to speak, surround China. And at this stage, it's still very much about China itself. They're beginning to see that there are consequences of this. One of the consequences, or we mentioned it, is it's not really an embargo at this stage by the Americans in 1940, but they stop supplying certain material to the Japanese. The most important thing, however, they still continue to supply is normal oil. So the ships can still go and the vehicles can still go. That's fine. Aviation fuel at that stage is already out, but the other oil is still flowing. But the Japanese are beginning to see that there's going to be a long-term issue here. If they can't defeat the Chinese quickly, they can't bring their version of peace to this part of the world, and there's an ongoing conflict, this will only get worse. And this is where they're now beginning to look at other options. Where do we need to go in order to make sure that Japan can survive as a great nation? And you just need to look at the map to see the logistical challenges that Japan has, because the distances these guys have to cover, even going from Japan to mainland China, or perhaps even to French Indochina, are vast. That means ships, big ships, and big ships need a lot of oil. So you can all begin to see how this is going to shape the minds of the Japanese political and also military planners. What you also find is, in their perception, a growing potential of aggressiveness from the Americans, because the Americans are now moving their fleet to Pearl Harbor. That's why it sits there now. They're also reinforcing, increasing the garrison in the Philippines. There is an idea to begin with that if war breaks out, the Americans will make a last stand. They've got 40,000 men there, which doesn't sound a lot, but by the standards of the day, the U.S. Army is still quite small. This is a sizable chunk of the U.S. Army at that particular time. Even though the Americans who are actually in the Philippines said, oh, you know what, this will not work. We need at least 400,000 to defend it. But you can see that they're moving towards, they're trying to contain a potential further aggression, as they would see it, by Japan. And in many ways, I would think that really pushes the American thinking over the edge, so to speak, is the fact that they now take over French Indochina, because that changes the game. I mean, it's not only China, but first of all, it's now a different part of Asia. Yes, it's still the same area, but beginning to see the strategic implications of this. You're getting very close to Malaya, for example. You're getting close to Burma.
Singapore.
These are British colonies. Singapore, that's the main thing, isn't it? That's the largest fortress in the world at the time. Probably the biggest defeat the British Empire has ever seen in its history. No one talks about it. It's absolutely fascinating. It's, I would say, more or less written out of history. Really, really interesting. But even in those days, that was important. Then if you go further south, then of course you hit the Dutch, the Netherlands, East Indies, and they are important. Again, we can go into much more detail later on if we want to, because of raw materials. That's oil and that is rubber. Rubber in those days is absolutely crucial for the war effort. And you begin to see when you look at the map, if you are American, if you're British, you are Dutch. Well, the Dutch are kind of out because they've also lost in 1940. But you're beginning to get cold feet here. You say, what's going on here? So where they're going? It's no longer just about mainland China, even though that is still the driving force. And things are decided because of things that happen or do not happen in China, but they're now beginning to touch more directly on other nations and other colonies. And I think that's important here. Also because French Indochina, of course, as I said, it's a French colony. So in the thinking of the people at that time, that makes a difference. These are not, please forgive me for what I say now, small yellow people running around. These are actually small yellow people controlled by the French. So this is a European-run part of the world. If the Japanese take this over, this is very different. It has a different feel to the peoples at that particular time because it's still the time of imperialism where you have these empires. And if an Asian nation takes over a Western colony, that sends out some really stark and confusing messages at that time.
Yeah, and one other aspect to Japan's desire to choke off foreign assistance for China is that they pressure the UK to close the Burma Road supply line in 1940. Basically, we're in 1940 right now, folks. If you needed a reminder to help you keep track of how close we're getting to the Pearl Harbor moment, we're about in 1940 now, where the Japanese occupy northern Indochina in September 1940, southern Indochina a little bit later, and they force the UK to temporarily close their Burma Road, which is a smaller supply route into China, let's say. When all this happens, you can see reactions from the US that you mentioned, right? They introduced the first peacetime draft, and they introduced some sanctions about aviation fuel and scrap metal and things like that. Japan is still looking to resolve this potential conflict, to improve its security if ever there's going to be a conflict with the Western powers. So in September 1940, it signs the tripartite pact with Italy and Germany. So basically, what you have is that Japanese imperial designs are bringing them into conflict with the Western powers. Japanese imperial designs on China, to start with, are bringing them into conflict with the Western powers, which pushes them, of course, or makes it appealing for them to become close with other enemies of the Western powers, namely Italy and Germany. That's not to say that everybody in Japan agrees on the best strategy. As I mentioned, the army and the navy are kind of pulling policy discussions in opposite directions because the navy, of course, is looking south and towards the Pacific, and the army is very concerned with finishing the war in China and any potential threat coming from the Soviet Union. A guy by the name of Hideki Tojo is the war minister at this time, and under him, the influence of the army increases. So again, here we see more arrows pointing. This is my favorite theme for today, pointing towards China as a center of gravity for Japanese decision making. In fact, the foreign minister at the time that the tripartite pact is signed, he says, "The army is the playwright of the pact, and I am a mere actor." So there he's kind of saying, the tail is wagging the dog in a way, and the army and its focus on China is one of the most influential aspects of this entire situation. And to round off my little contribution here, in April 1941, now we're going a little bit further on the timeline, Japan signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So this basically resolves one of the three strategic threat or opportunity directions for Japan towards the north. The Soviet threat is taken care of. Now they can concentrate on what do we have to do to win this war in China. And that is, for many Japanese, looking like we need to continue moving south to strike at the supporters of China, the colonial powers that are supporting China.
And that's, as we already said, that's what the Japanese do when they take over French Indochina, and they're looking at these other areas as well. So Burma, Singapore, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies for the reasons that we've already explained, not at least because they're economic as well. And as a consequence of everything that's happening now in this time, the Americans now take another step, which you might say doesn't even look that drastic, particularly, for example, when you look at what happens in Russia and Ukraine these days, but what had a massive impact for the Japanese, because in July 1941, the Americans finally cease oil exports to Japan. Now, there's two things that are quite interesting. First of all, the fact that oil exports per se are so important that now accelerates this escalation. And the second thing I would argue is that the Americans waited that long. That also tells you quite a bit. Why did they wait so long when you could see what was going on? Well, one of the reasons for that is that because in 1940 and 1941, even though you're kind of already moving towards some sort of conflict between Japan and America, people in those days saw that. But of course, well, looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, we now see very clearly these different steps. In those days, people were still trying to avoid this, and they were trying to avoid it on both sides, because both sides say, you know what, there's nothing really we can gain from a conflict here. The Japanese don't want to fight the Americans because they don't want to invade America or anything like this. They've got interests in other part of China. The Americans are not really interested. However, on the 18th of August 1941, Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take, as they called, opposing steps if neighboring countries of Japan or the occupied areas were attacked, i.e. if you spread further into the southeast, if you take British colonies or Dutch colonies, we will have something to say about this. Nevertheless, both sides tried to improve the relations during 1941. And it's quite interesting when you look at what the Japanese are actually offering. This is quite far-reaching and widespread. So, for example, they offered to withdraw from most of China and Indochina after making peace with the nationalist government. That, of course, is the important thing. Not immediately, because that would be seen as a defeat. So you make peace with the nationalists, and then you withdraw, keeping Manchukuo, because that was seen as a proper part of Japan at that time, a bit more than a colony. So keep that. But the rest of mainland China, we withdraw from that. It also suggested or proposed what they called an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact, which is really interesting because it's, in theory, it's a defensive pact between, you already mentioned it, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And they said we can have a different interpretation, which means whatever happens between the Americans and the Brits and the Germans and the Italians, we're basically keeping out of this. So we're a neutral country. So that's an interesting move in itself. Open a quick bracket here. It's quite interesting anyway that Japan was invited to sign this, because when you go back to the racial ideas of Hitler and Nazism, I mean, it's quite interesting that they would get an Asian power in. Because why would you go with these guys? Well, it's a very, very obvious reason, because he couldn't go with the people he really wanted to go with, and then, of course, with the British. They basically didn't want a treaty with Hitler. As Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, once said, the British simply don't want to be loved by us. There we are. So he got the same idea. So basically, he was just looking for any sort of alliance and partner he could find, and that's why he goes with Japan. But that close bracket, so it's a small thing.
I think I would want to jump in and add a wrinkle to Japanese intentions in China, and this idea that if they're going to withdraw from China, I think it's important that we remind ourselves under what conditions that more or less could have happened. Because Japan's intention, of course, was to hold a dominant, exploitative position vis-a-vis China. So when we say, as you mentioned, that in the course of these negotiations with the United States and the oil embargo that they put in July 1941, which is, by the way, the very month when Japan completely finishes occupying French Indochina, that's kind of one of the triggers for the oil embargo, that when the Japanese say, well, we would make peace with the nationalists, They don't mean we would just go away and China would be a completely sovereign country. Of course not. They mean an imperial imposed peace that would not meet the US interests, of course, right? So even though that offer is on the table, it doesn't mean that it's going to realistically lead to peace. Just to be clear for our listeners out there, I wanted to throw a couple of other little spanners in the works here. The US in 1940 does something else. I forgot to mention this before. They announce a huge naval building program where they want to increase the naval tonnage by 70% in 8 years. And that's adding 257 new ships. Now, if you're the Japanese, this has an impact on your strategic thinking because you cannot match that with your industry, right? So we're starting to see now, we've gone from big picture imperial competition. We've got to resolve the war in China. That's going to put us in conflict with the Western powers. Okay, how far can we push that? Some sanctions too. Now there's a timeline on stuff for Japan because they calculate that around the end of 1941 is when this American building program would permanently tip the balance in the US's favor in terms of naval forces in the Pacific. And once the oil embargo comes into place, because the Japanese get about 80% of their oil from the US, that they have reserves for maximum 2 years of oil. So, yeah, we go from a kind of strategic competition and tensions to a real timeline for what the Japanese would see as kind of military necessity. And that's, I think, another quite underrated but crucial step in the path towards Pearl Harbor. The famous Admiral Yamamoto felt the urgency of this. He's already saying, if we strike at the US, we have to strike at the initial stage. And then as they build new fleets, he expects them to be able to continue to build new fleets. We need to destroy them one by one as they are built. So already you're kind of getting into some very risky mental gymnastics about what your strategic options are going to be.
Isn't it interesting when you look at this? And of course, you're absolutely right. You can see some interesting links here to, for example, the outbreak of the First World War, or also the outbreak of the Second World War, where you have similar arguments. So the enemy are building up stronger armies, stronger forces, so we need to strike now while we are still superior. So you can see how the story repeats itself. And of course, you're absolutely right when you talk about the peace treaty. I mean, this is why the Japanese say when they talk to the Americans, we are going to withdraw after we've signed a peace treaty with a nationalist government. And it's obvious in the Japanese mind on whose terms that's going to be. You're absolutely right. It's not equal partners coming to some sort of balanced and negotiated peace. And as a consequence of that, of course, the Americans reject that. And I say, you know what, this is all barking mad, so that's not going to happen. You've got more diplomatic interaction, of course, at that particular time. For example, the American ambassador to Japan, he urges the American president to meet the Japanese Prime Minister Konoe. The Americans say, no, I'm just going to meet him after we sign the treaty. The government in Japan then falls over this. There's all sorts of stuff going on. But the timelines are really important. And you can see how the room for action and maneuver on the Japanese side is now shrinking. And it's now moving really towards decision point. And they make a last step attempt in November 1941, so very, very close to Pearl Harbor. And on the 20th, they sent another offer to the Americans in which they offered to withdraw from southern Indochina and refrain from attacks in Southeast Asia, as long as, that's interesting, the US, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, who are still in charge of that part of the world at that time, supply 1 million US gallons, that's about 3.8 million liters, roughly speaking, I think, not being American, and that's interesting, of aviation fuel, and lift their sanctions against Japan and cease aid to China. So again, everything we've talked about comes together here. So first of all, it's the oil, particularly aviation at that time, sanctions against Japan and aid for China. So China is still very much in the center of the Japanese thinking here. The Americans send a counter-proposal but exactly 6 days later, and arrives in Japan exactly a week later on the 27th of November, the so-called Hull Note. which states that Japan has to completely evacuate China. So coming back to what we said earlier about this peace treaty, but now without conditions, and conclude a non-aggression pact with all the other Pacific powers. So you can see again, China very, very much in the center of this thinking. And even before this note arrives on the 26th, that's when it gets sent from America, it arrives in Japan the 27th. On the 26th of November, the Japanese fleet gets the order to sail to Pearl Harbor. So they've already made a decision. They sent another note back in which they say very clearly, negotiations have failed. Unfortunately, we don't know what to do anymore. But that's the next step then. But you can see here how this room for maneuver, the action actually, it's all being pushed now by the timeline. And as you said earlier, the Japanese military are now beginning to take over. You've got these fights and these factions between the army and the navy. You said that. You mentioned Yamamoto. Yamamoto offers his resignation because he doesn't initially get what he wants. So there's a lot of in-house fighting going on there, obviously, because it's the army against the navy. There are people saying, no, we should continue attacking China. Is it really worth attacking America? Why are we doing this? That's interesting. And that's also interesting when you look at the underlying reasons as to why Japan wants to attack now at Pearl Harbor. It's not because they want to get the US into a war, because they know winning a war against the US is quite difficult. It's actually quite the opposite. They want to cripple the military, the naval might of the US before the shipbuilding program really kicks in, which they hope, in some sort of rather twisted thinking, would cause the Americans not to go to war against Japan, which is really kind of weird when you think that one through. But that's the main argument that was brought forward why attacking America is now so very important. They hope that once you've done that, however, and how they would do it and why they would do it, the Americans would turn the taps again and start sending fuel to Japan. So it's really kind of very twisted thinking in many ways, you might say.
An extreme faulty intelligence assessment of the enemy and his will to fight, his intentions, and so on and so forth. A very extreme. I think there are some reasons for that. There are some ideological reasons for that. There are some quotes I've read from Japanese military men who are convinced that they would lose if they started a war with the US, but that their honor and the spirit of the great Japanese people requires them to do it anyway, and so on and so forth. So there are all sorts of different influences that go in under the surface a little bit. What I want to say a word about now is that while these negotiations are going on with the Americans back and forth, the Japanese are planning for things and they're making decisions, and they're making those plans and even decisions a little bit earlier on. So here I'm going to try to frame a bit of a picture that puts the responsibility much more on Japan, because there is an argument, I think, or there's some evidence that they weren't really negotiating in good faith with the US. Not only were the interests not really compatible, but that the Japanese were planning and deciding for war a little earlier on. For example, in July 1941, when the oil embargo comes in, there's an emergency meeting of the Japanese leadership, and it results in a policy paper. Don't worry, people, I'm not going to quote from a policy paper at length. I'm sure you can watch paint dry if you want a similar experience at home. But it is called Outline of National Policies in View of the Changing Situation. So suitably bureaucratic language. It comes out in July 1941, and it contains this little nugget. Our empire will continue its efforts to effect a settlement of the China incident, which is what they called their invasion of China, euphemistically, the special military operation of the day, the China incident, and will seek to establish a solid basis for the security and preservation of the nation. This will involve taking steps to advance south. So again, here you have this idea. China's the main problem. To solve it, we will advance south, which means essentially against the US. So this isn't a direct war plan, but you can see the intention, you can see the direction that all the circumstances are pushing this thinking. They draw up plans for potential invasions also in the summer of Thailand, which is neutral, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, Borneo, Hong Kong, Philippines, Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, they're actively planning for the case where they will invade these places already in August 41. There's a little hiccup in September 41. The emperor all of a sudden quotes a peace poem at a meeting, and everyone's confused and shocked and like, oh, maybe he doesn't want this anymore. But and the prime minister Konoe is kind of hemming and hawing about maybe we should compromise with the Americans. Tojo, though, is firm and says, no, we have to do it. And one of his justifications is, and I'm quoting again here one line from Tojo, we've lost 160,000 lives so far in the China incident. If we go on talking with the Americans, we will lose our chance to fight. We're already losing valuable time for operations. So here again, we see China at the center as the root of the problem. And then this time pressure, this timeline that's playing on Japanese minds. Of course, Konoe then resigns. Tojo becomes prime minister and war minister. And on November 1st, the cabinet basically decides on war for early December. So November 1st is a long time before those final flurry of notes and exchanges in the negotiations that you talked about, Matthias. So they have this 17-hour meeting, the Japanese do. Maybe this podcast feels like 17 hours to you listeners, but it's been flying by for me because it's a fascinating topic. They had this 17-hour meeting, and on November 1st, finally the Navy minister agrees, okay, we can make the Southern strike, because the Navy was the one concerned about potential ramifications of fighting the US, right? The Army kind of underestimated the US a bit more. This is all a done deal, essentially, by November 1st, I would argue. I would argue from what I've read. And the emperor on December 1st, they're in another meeting, and the emperor, when they say, basically, we're going to do it, the emperor just quietly gets up and leaves the room. And apparently that was a sign for him being okay with stuff. So if he reads a poem, he's not okay with stuff. If he quietly gets up and leaves, he's okay with stuff. I don't claim to understand Japanese culture. I'm just saying.
I think you're right. You really need to read between the lines here. Say, coming back to your timelines, for example, say on the 1st of November, they decide that they're probably going to go to war unless they really get what they want from the Americans, which is highly unlikely. On the 26th, the Navy, the fleet then sails. Getting a big fleet as it is, ready with planes, with resupply, with everything on board, that doesn't happen overnight. So they were prepared for this. On the other hand, what you also have to say, of course, is that military planning does not necessarily lead to political decisions. So the fact that you have military planning somewhere going on does not necessarily mean that it's going to go to war. Otherwise, well, the famous example that the British were planning the invasion of America in the 1930s. It's a war game. Of course, no one takes this seriously. Or the fact that Churchill ordered his staff to look at continuing the Second World War, but now against the Soviet Union. So you have to be slightly careful that just because they planned something does not mean it's going to happen. You might actually say, from a pure military point of view, you have to do all this planning. You have to have lots of different course of actions. You always have three that you present to your commander, always the one that you want to go with. And that normally means you choose two other ones, which are so wacky that you simply can't choose them. So you guide the guy towards it, but you have always different course of actions. But within the context of what goes on in Japan at the time, this is not completely set apart. They don't do this war planning in a vacuum. So that's absolutely right. And one thing that's also interesting when you look at this political area and then linked to the pure military realm is, of course, the Japanese understanding and negotiations and talks with their allies. And that is mainly with the Germans. So finally, I can talk about the Germans again. Thank God for that. Haven't we talked about them? Because this is also quite crucial. So you have meetings between the Japanese ambassador and Hitler and Ribbentrop, who is the foreign minister, on pretty much, I wouldn't say a daily basis, but quite often at that particular time, building up towards the outbreak of war. And the messages they are sent from Berlin is also very interesting, because in the early stage, a number of people in the German camp would talk to the Japanese and say, no, look at the map. What you need to do is you need to invade the Soviet Union. Well, first of all, you've got some beef with them anyway because of previous history, and also that would really help the Germans as they invade the Soviet Union, which they do in June 1941. And even in the German camp, there is a big debate. First of all, is it wise to go to the Soviet Union? But that's a different argument. And then what happens next? Is the Soviet Union defeated, yes or no? And Hitler comes to the conclusion in November that the Soviet Union is actually defeated. This whole story is, again, a different podcast about why did Hitler declare war on the US and what happened in Moscow, a different story. But it's all part of this decision-making cycle, basically brought down into a period of about 2 or 3 weeks, which you might say really changed the course of history. Because Hitler decides, regardless of what's going to happen within the next 2 or 3 weeks, that the Soviet Union is defeated. That means Japan doesn't have to attack the Soviet Union anymore. And he says, well, if you want to go and attack someone, it might be quite a good idea to attack the British, because Germany is also still at war with Britain. That would be quite useful. But he also understands that that would probably bring the US into the war anyway. So why not attack the US right away? Practically, the US are already at war with Germany as well, when you look at what goes on in the Atlantic. So Hitler sends out very strong signals as well, so that you might say perhaps it doesn't decide what the Japanese are doing, but yet it's another indicator, it's another supporting nudge, you might say, when it comes to this whole thing. And he says, you know what, the Soviet Union, they're done for, you don't have to worry about them. The main enemy is now America. And by the way, if you declare war, we're probably going to do the same thing. So there's going to be a two-pronged attack, and we're going to outmaneuver the Americans because the Soviet Union has been defeated. As I said, it's not the deciding factor because the Japanese make their own decisions, but it's probably something that's in the back of their heads as well.
I think this plays into one of the dynamics of the situation on the Japanese side, which is, as one Japanese politician put it, I'm speaking from memory here, this is a golden opportunity. We're not going to have an opportunity like this for 1,000 years or something along those lines. The Soviet Union is either beaten or at least weakened and distracted. Plus, we have a non aggression treaty with them. Britain and France, and to a lesser extent, the Netherlands, they're either beaten or also completely distracted by the war in Europe. The only rival that we have that is preventing us from achieving our imperial goals in China is the US. So it's not going to get better than this from that line of thinking, which reminds me a lot of the German line of thinking, as you mentioned precedents, right, in 1914. So better now than later. And I think that's a very dangerous kind of political and strategic thinking, better now than later. It's a kind of slippery slope, if you will. And I also find it interesting, returning to the China theme, which I've been beating like a rented mule now for 2 episodes because I find it such an interesting argument. If you start a war and you don't have a clear objective on how to achieve a sustainable political strategic victory out of it, it's going to then take away so many other military and policy options from you and push and force you towards bad and risky military and policy options. And I think Japan finds itself in that bind in 1941. Lots of smart Japanese leaders were saying we should not attack the US. But the absolutely compelling and driving almost necessity was winning the war in China. And it just pushes them towards this decision. To say one final, from me at least, I think, word about this, the question that we've been exploring in a way throughout these last 2 episodes. Why did Japan decide to attack Pearl Harbor? Usually in popular history, on the internet, YouTube, and so on, podcasts, oil is usually the most popular explanation for this. That the US put these sanctions, and then Japan had no choice because they were going to run out of oil. You know, that obviously plays a role. We mentioned that here. It makes things, it pushes that timeline, it puts pressure on Japan to make a rash decision. On the other hand, as we've talked about, Japan had been expanding and had been expanding violently for quite a long time. One can interpret the oil sanctions not as the cause of the Japanese desire to expand, but as a response to expansion that was already taking place and was already violent and imperial. And on the China side, we've talked at length now about how China was at the center of all these other elements, including why the embargo came to be. It's because of Japanese decisions based on trying to win the war in China. And that, folks, was my elevator sales pitch on why China is a bigger factor than oil, or the cause of the oil factor for why Japan decided to attack the US at Pearl Harbor.
And there might be one other reason if we bring it down again to the pure military thinking, because we talked a lot about economics, we talked a lot about politics and land warfare. But let's not forget Pearl Harbor is planes attacking a naval force. And it's interesting when you look at the theory and the doctrine that the Japanese Navy subscribed to at that time. It goes back to an American naval officer and theorist, Mahon he was called, and he said it's all about control of the sea lanes. If you control the shipping lanes, you control basically the world. He goes back to the history of the British Empire. He said it's not a great land power, but because they control the sea, they can do whatever they like. They're in charge.
The Influence of Sea Power on History, I think, was the
Correct.
name of his book, wasn't it?
So there we are. And he said, and you can link that again back to the Chinese piece, because to get from Japan to China, you need to get across the sea. And of course, he also says if you have to go to war, really decisive are only wars at sea. Of course, he would say that as a Navy person, very obvious. But he also says that the only thing that really matters and decides the outcome of a war at sea are major battles. And that's why you need to go for the enemy fleet. That's the important thing. And this is also why, for example, also Japanese, regardless of the aircraft carriers, what have you, put a lot of material and resource into major battleships, which is also one of the reasons why they're quite happy and content when they basically sink the American cruisers and battleships. But you all know the story, listeners out there, the big question, the big myth. Is it a myth? Is it not a myth? Did the Americans know that the Japanese were coming? That's why they sent the carriers out, yes or no? There's a big debate about this still ongoing. Let's not go into this. But they were quite happy to sink the battleships and didn't bother too much about the fact that they hadn't sunk any of the aircraft carriers, because in their thinking, their philosophy at that time, it was all the big battleships, which is quite ironic because what do they use to sink all of these? Of course, it's planes from aircraft carriers. So they kind of out-acted their own doctrine to a degree, you might say, which is quite interesting. But that's a pure military reason why, or military philosophical reason, why the Japanese then decided to really go for that attack and attack Pearl Harbor.
I think that's a nice addition to the sort of bigger strategic picture that we've been talking about as well, with the politics and the imperial goals in China and so forth. I would like to point out, since you mentioned the myth of Pearl Harbor or the legend of whether the US knew and so on, we did deal with that in a previous podcast. So listeners, you can go back through our catalog and hear our opinions on that particular theory. So, folks, it's been a long time coming, but we've come to the end of part 2 of our exploration of the long origins, the long fuse behind the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor. We hope that you found that little exercise of interest. I know I certainly did. Thank you to the listeners out there who encouraged us to return to Pacific War related topics, because it was high time and it was certainly worth the time I put in preparing for the podcast. I also want to remind you, listeners out there, before we sign off for today, if you like the podcast, if you want to support us in what we do, and if you want to get in touch with some other people who have similar interests and with us from time to time, we have a new members community program, and you can find out more about the benefits and what you can do to support us and be a part of all that at bothsidesofthewire.com. So go and check that out, and we will see you all in our next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.